everyone. Welcome back to Chats with Kat on the Voice of Adoptees podcast. I am your host, Kat. I hope everyone is having a great week so far. So don't forget to grab your coffee, tea, or a preferred beverage and settle on in. I am currently here with Kellan, and they are a breathwork facilitator, a somatic therapist. So introduce yourself to those who are listening and how you're connected to adoption.
Hi everyone. So I'm Kellan, and as Kat just mentioned, I'm doing breathwork facilitation and somatic therapy, and I am a transracial adoptee from China, and I was adopted, the year of my birth, so 1998, which makes me feel kind of old now, and I was adopted from Jiangsu province, and as well as being a transracial adoptee, I'm also trans and transmasc, so I use they them pronouns and identify as non-binary, but present in, I guess, what people would consider a more stereotypical masculine fashion, but very much non-binary and don't really relate to being a man. So that's my intro.
So that's really interesting. I have a lot I want to talk about and kind of get into. For you, where does your adoption story begin? Like, what age were you adopted?
Okay, so I was adopted, I was 8 months old when I was adopted. So I feel like that's kind of like middle for quite a lot of inter-country adoptees. And I think a lot of people consider adoption and how early you're adopted to be a really good thing. But I think a lot of people don't appreciate how attachment theory and trauma works within the body, and that actually often the younger we are, the more we're in that kind of crucial developmental age, and the more that actually being separated from our roots and our family, just completely overwhelms a baby's nervous system. So I think in my life, I'm definitely sure, but especially with like working with other adoptees in the trans adoptee community, I see a lot of these effects where people kind of regards us as being saved, and it being a good thing that, oh, it's fine, you don't remember, so you're really lucky in all this stuff. But actually, a lot of people don't realize that it's kind of the worst, the worst time, the earlier, under the ages of 2, 3, everything is subconscious. Everything that happens to us is directly impacting how our brain and nervous system is kind of calibrating itself. So the adoptees that were relinquished, and especially when we've gone through all this stuff where we've not only been relinquished, but then we're maybe taken to an institution and an orphanage, and then we're then taken to another country from there. That's a lot of change and a lot of trauma, really, for a little nervous system to go through.
It's a lot of trauma really quickly in life. The relinquishment wound is something that was kind of new to me. I'm writing my PhD on adoption and media, and how the media portrays adoption as a whole. And I just thought that was very interesting. And in my research, I came upon that. And I think it's something that is important to speak about, because it's sort of this thing where we as the adoptee don't really understand why we have these sort of feelings, and they're kind of there. And it's like you said, people say like, well, you were too little to remember. And there's a really great psychologist who actually introduced this sort of topic to me. And at the moment, I'm forgetting his name, which is probably not a good thing. But he was saying that with adoption will always come trauma, because it's relinquishment. With relinquishment always comes trauma. And your mind may not remember. You may not be able to recall it, but your body will always remember it. There's a really interesting point about blood, and how a lot of adoptees who find their families kind of say this sort of feeling of, when I found my family, my whole body was screaming at me. And that's kind of because, our blood knows our blood. And it's it's a very interesting sort of thing. So you were adopted at 8 months old, and you've probably gone through just the whole thing where it's like, you were too little to remember, like, why is this such a big deal for you? Plus, you were also experiencing other sort of battles and journeys within yourself, right? And I feel just that is very overwhelming, just from the amount that I've experienced. So I couldn't imagine how hard it was to
Mm-hmm.
feel like you could find yourself in terms of like your own identity.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think you touched on, well, multiple amazing points there, really. In that, I think, growing up as adoptees, where we don't feel valid in anything, really. We're
Right,
struggling to find ourselves, and on top of all this really, really deep trauma that we've gone through is seen as being saved in society. So our grief and our emotions, they're all disenfranchised. And yeah, it's hard to find yourself when you can't. I think you have to be able to acknowledge what you've gone through, really, in order to, like, you have to look back to be able to look forward, kind of thing, and find who you are. And yeah, I definitely relate to that struggle. I think growing up of just knowing who I was. I think it was only really when lockdown happened and the Black Lives Matter movement came to the forefront that I even realized that I was actually a person of color. Like, I'd just associated myself with being white. I'd grown up in a very kind of white area, where there wasn't much exposure to different cultures and different ethnicities. So I was like, oh, like I'm actually not white, and it was kind of like a
right.
revelation for me. Um, yeah, and I think my kind of, they call it coming out the fog,
Yes.
with adoption,
Mhm.
which I kind of like in a way because of its connotations with coming out, with being queer. Although the whole
Right.
coming out thing is a whole different topic. Like, some people don't like the term, and prefer it as more like inviting people in to your life. But yeah, what was I saying? Oh yeah. So yeah, coming out of the fog, I think for me happened again as lockdown was kind of a big thing, and I think it was just that time away from people, and I know it was like horrible for a lot of people, and it was really hard not being able to be in contact with people, but at the same time, I think I kind of enjoyed it in a way. I don't know about
Right.
you. I think I felt I really needed that just space and like a bubble where it was like I got to be myself, and it was just me with me, rather than having all these kind of societal pressures put on me. It's like you realize who you are without
Right.
people watching you. And so, just going back a little bit, I had like a mental health crisis just before lockdown. So
Right.
I think for me, it kind of was great, great timing if you can have great timing with a mental health
Right.
crisis, because I kind of went into recovery just as lockdown started. But for me, it was very much that mental health crisis made me realize just how much adoption played a role in my struggles, and just how much I've been denying for so many years. And I talk about relinquishment trauma and adoption trauma, and how trauma is held in the body, really readily these days. But back then, I didn't know anything about that. I just felt, and I think a lot of adoptees will relate to this, I just felt broken. Like, I just felt infixable, and like everything was wrong with me, and I was trying to like fix myself, but without really having that awareness, like that crucial awareness, that I needed to, yeah, just acknowledge what I was actually facing. Um, and, I think that kind of leads me on to the point where it's like the society and our kind of medical diagnosis system often labels us as broken and angry and rejection, sensitivity, dysphoria, all of these labels, BPD, but actually, myself included with this, where a lot of trauma experts kind of regard like 90% of the DSM as, just symptoms of trauma. And it's like, that's how we've adapted to survive from what we've gone through, rather than it being a fault with us. And I think sometimes that is really nice to kind of reframe it that way.
So something I think that you mentioned is very interesting, and you mentioned about how you internalized during the whole, I'm not sure what's wrong on my voice, I apologize. But you internalized, right? Do you feel like a lot of adoptees sort of internalize these feelings, and they're all basically put on by us, like for us by society, right? By our adoptive family, and then the adoptive family learns from society to sort of have this viewpoint of adoption, whether adoptive parents are supposed to be the savior, and the adopted child is supposed to be grateful. And I think that kind of negates the way that the actual adoptee feels. So as a result, we internalize because we feel like we can't really talk to the adoptive parent. And I think that also goes for potentially counseling, where maybe counseling is viewed as not helpful because it's not necessarily understanding of the adoptee struggle. I feel like I had a question in there somewhere and I forget what it was, but I just wanted to know like what your viewpoint on that was.
Yeah, for sure. I think, where you were quoting where that person was like, I can't remember the exact quote, but that in adoption, there's always trauma.
Yes.
And, I think that's really true. And, the thing with trauma is that trauma isn't what happened to us, it's what happened inside of us, as the renowned trauma expert Gabor Mate says a lot. And it's all to do with our nervous system. So I think even the most resilient nervous systems genetically, with relinquishment and adoption, they're still going to be traumatized to some extent. And I think it wires us up to just always be hypervigilant and looking out for any sort of potential rejection where it could equal losing everything again, because that's basically what happened. So it's understandable that, as our nervous system and our body and our brain is trying to protect us from that again. And so we do, without even realizing, I think we fawn and we become the golden child that society wants us to be, and the high achievers and the perfect child that doesn't rebel or doesn't go against their parents, and even without knowing. Because I think when I was growing up that I was, that I had a lot of agency. But I think actually there's so much in me, and I think there's still conditioning now that I'm still working through, where I feel like I owe my parents, my adopted parents, my life almost, and I feel like I owe it to them to do things with like work or how much I achieve in life. And on top of that, there's all the societal conditioning and capitalism and colonialism, and when you put all that together, it's like, how on earth do we actually like crawl our way out of this and actually find what's authentic to us?
Yeah,
and it's as a queer adoptee, sorry.
No, because like I want to just touch on that point right there about the expectation from within us, the adoptee, to stay and take care of the parent, the adoptive parent. There's sort of there's this is not really spoken about a lot. I personally had a lot of experience with this, so I know exactly where you're coming from. But the feeling that you need to almost stay because they saved your life, sort of thing, and that's an immense amount of guilt that we feel, that we don't really want to feel. We don't really know how to feel. We want to go and find ourselves, but we also feel guilty for doing so. Right.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I'm not really sure like what to say about it because I'm still relinquishing that. Talking about relinquishment, like I'm relinquishing that guilt. I'm
Mm.
trying to,
Hmm.
um, because I do feel like it is very damaging to hold on to. But at the same time, I feel like adoptees are not given the proper resources in order to begin those steps to let go.
No.
We're kind of left for ourselves.
No, definitely
Yeah.
not. Definitely, definitely. Yeah, we're really left to, if anything, I think the systems around us really not just leave us, but are directly
Right.
against us because they set us up. Where it's almost like they don't want us to realize all these things about adoption. The system, $1 billion industry of adoption, doesn't want
Right.
us or like the family or adoptive parents to realize what really goes on. And it's like how, there's laws to protect dogs from being separated
Right.
from the mother when they're young, but when it comes to humans, it's like, oh, it's fine to just ship them off at any age. It won't affect them at all as long
Yeah.
as they don't
I
remember. So yeah, it's like make that make sense.
Right. I always found that very interesting when it came to animals that people seem to care more than when it came to people. It's kind of, or, I mean, they people do care when it comes to children, but I just feel like for a lot of adult adoptees that I speak to, because I get both good and bad. I hear the positives of it and I hear the negatives of it. And I feel like I'm in a place where I want to try to understand both sides and kind of make my own decision and carve my own route, right? And I think media has like a really big
Hmm.
role in that. I feel like adoptees are just portrayed very badly, and the parents are always portrayed wonderfully, and the biological family is actually not portrayed very well either. So it kind of just adds to the whole you were saved complex. You should be grateful. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for
Yeah,
this, that, and the other.
yeah.
But at the same time, adoptees don't know the struggle or the sacrifice that adoptive parents have to go through. But it's also like sometimes with not all, I'm trying not to offend the adoptive parent community right now, but not all adoptive parents are, it doesn't represent all adoptive parents, just like it doesn't represent all adoptees and it doesn't represent all biological
Mm.
parents, you know.
Yeah.
So I just think it's interesting to see the relationship between media and the perception
Mm.
of adoption, adoptees, and how we kind of view the world because of it, if that made sense.
Yeah. 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 I think talking of media, like the adoptee identity is so varied and nuanced.
Yes,
It's like there's no way that could be accurately represented. I don't think we need so much more representation to even start touching on it. And so far, I feel like all I've seen is, yeah, either stories that reinforce that savior
right,
narrative that adoptees should feel grateful, or the adoptee is like this delusional villain, and it's like, yeah, they've got trauma, but then you're made to hate them because they're murdering people or
right,
they're evil. And so I think the societal perception of adoptees is like really distorted through that. And I think a lot of people say to me things like, oh, I'll just adopt when I'm older, as if like you can just go to the store, like the supermarket, and just like grab a baby, and it's like really easy. And there's
right.
that's it. It's super simple, and I think that's almost the way it's portrayed, is that there's nothing really to consider there. It's just super easy. And yeah, like you said, there's a lot that goes into being an adopted parent, and then there's also a lot that goes into being an adoptee and growing up as an adoptee,
Right.
turning into an adult,
I just I just feel
and
like
having
there's no
to.
grace for the adoptee from the adoptive parent, I guess. You know what I mean? Not always. I think nowadays it's getting better, but I think in the past, adoptees who were raised by a different generation, maybe. I don't know. Again, I apologize if this is offensive, but it's just my personal experience with my mom having been a much older generation, a different generation. And again, she doesn't represent all parents, but I think it's different because sometimes, again, maybe not nowadays, but it's kind of like you adopt a child, but you don't necessarily, you feel like you don't sign on board for all the different things that come with the child. And that was kind of my experience. My mom didn't really care that I had
Mm,
all these different questions or that I was trying to find myself. She didn't really, she was more like, be who I want you to be, not who you think you are, sort of deal. And I
mm,
feel like for
mm-hmm.
my age
Yeah.
in adoptees, that's very common. That's a very common thing I've heard. And I just think
Mm-hmm.
it's changing
Yeah, for
from
sure.
a lot of the newer adoptive parents that I have spoken to, where I've never seen it where it's like they are so empathetic to the adoptee. It's nice to hear, but
Right.
I'm like taken
Okay.
aback. I'm like, wow, this is strange. I
Mm,
wasn't used to it.
yeah. 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 I mean, that's actually really
Right.
reassuring, I think, to hear, because I think that's where, I'd like to see, like, how I'd like the adoption system to be reformed is that adoptive parents have so much more understanding. Because in a way, I guess our adoptive parents, because there wasn't that awareness and knowledge back then about adoption trauma, it's like they technically didn't sign on to that. I mean, they did, but unknowingly. And I think, again, not to offend adoptive parents out there, this is just, again, my experience and what I've seen with that is kind of a common trend among the adoptees I know of around my age,
Mm,
is that our adoptive parents, and especially adoptive mothers, often kind of project their own things onto their adoptive child. And I think there's all this, not always the case, but sometimes there's infertility trauma that's kind of projected onto the child, and they've waited so long for this child. My parents, I think, were trying for a baby for 18 years
mm,
before they adopted me. And that's a lot of pressure for a child to live up to. To they've waited 18 years for you, and you've got to now live up for that. Even though you've already got this wound that says that you're unworthy, no matter what you do, you then feel like you have to make it up to them for waiting that long for you. Um, so I think there's a lot of internalized, just stuff with adoption and shame and guilt around being yourself. And, I think being relinquished in itself is quite a high shame thing to experience. Because, like, guilt is like, I've done something wrong. But then shame is like, I am wrong. And I think nothing says that more, I guess, than being relinquished as a baby. When
right.
that's all your subconscious can take in. And I think growing up as a queer adoptee, that's something that I felt a lot. And I can't say if I felt it more because I don't know what growing up as a non-queer adoptee would
Right.
be like. But for me, it felt very, very interwoven with finding both identities, in that I had all this guilt around who I was. And I think that really kind of impacted, I guess, how quickly I became aware of my identity.
Right.
I think, and again, as well, growing up in quite a white area, my parents were quite Christian when I was growing up. So I hadn't had very much exposure to queer
Right.
people and different diversities and stuff like that. So I think it was only when I was 14 that I realized that being gay wasn't a, in quotes, perverted choice. This is what I believed when I was younger. And that actually it was just how people were.
Yeah.
And that really got my head spinning at that point. And I think it was a little later when I started questioning my gender, and even just realizing that not identifying as the gender that they'd assigned you at birth was even a thing, that like things like top surgery and going on hormones was even a possibility. And so yeah, I think I was kind of battling this great desire to be myself and figure this out on my own, but also almost this like massive guilt that I needed to tell them.
Right.
But also the fear that then I'd then be rejected for who I was. So yeah, I think there's a lot that queer adoptees, I guess teens, kind of feeling through.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about specifically what you do as a breathwork facilitator, and when you say somatic, right? Somatic therapist?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, so somatics basically just refers to anything body-based. So in society and in kind of conventional, like regular counseling, we're something called like neck up. So we do everything with our heads basically. We're always analyzing and thinking and talking and picking things about, remembering. Whereas somatics is very neck down.
Right.
So we're working with the body and like the fascia and the nervous system. And it's really interesting because 80% of our afferent nervous system signals are from the body upwards. So 80% is going from what our body is feeling up to our brain, rather than kind of what our brain is thinking down to our body. So actually it has like a massive, massive impact on what we do with our bodies, with what our brain is thinking. So it's kind of reversing the kind of traditional model of how things work, in that I guess talk therapy is very much changing our thought patterns, using our willpower to kind of interrupt thoughts and change them. Whereas somatic therapy, neck down, is more of a bottom-up approach. So we're changing first how our body feels and allowing it to move, stored trauma, energy, knots in the muscles, tension in the body, and that is then impacting how we feel, and then thus changing automatically kind of how we think about things. And I'd done a lot of different therapies beforehand. Things like I'd seen adoption specialists. I'd done NLP, so neuro linguistic programming. I'd done DBT, so dialectic behavioral therapy, if I remember rightly.
Right.
And I'd just been in and out of different therapies, and especially after my mental health crises. But it wasn't until I developed COVID fatigue just over a year ago now that I kind of started getting into breathwork and somatics. And at first I was a complete skeptic, because I was just like, oh, everyone knows how to breathe. Like, I don't want someone just telling me to like breathe slowly, and it sounds really boring. And I was like, yeah, that sounds just tosh. And so I really rejected the idea of it until I got really desperate, because my COVID fatigue was really rough at the start. There's the whole like brain inflammation stuff going on, brain fog. I've always been like a super active person, and just not being able to be active at all was really, really depressing in itself for me. And so I was like, I'm desperate, I'll just try it. And it really, really, really was effective. And I was like, wow, I think I've stumbled upon something really cool here. And then I just randomly went to a class because I'd just been learning by myself. And I was like, oh, this will just be like enhancing what I already kind of know and building on it. But it was more of a trauma healing modality. And I have to be careful when I say healing, because, I don't want to make claims that it will 100% heal you. But it's a breathwork style that kind of allows us to, how to say this? kind of got this bell right. Yeah,
No,
like
take your time.
able to
I think
access
it's interesting.
able to access okay able to access subconscious parts of us and create enough nervous system activation to allow our trauma to naturally come up so that the body can actually process it in the way it was designed to. And I went for my first session of this and was like, wow, what just happened? Like, I felt I was able to feel things, and I think it might not be surprising that adoption related feelings came up a lot. A lot of anger and a lot of grief, and a lot of sadness, and these things came up, but in this way of doing it, it was like I was able to feel like I'd moved something and made a part of me that I'd never been able to even kind of access feel safer and feel more comforted and just more resolved.
Yeah.
So after that, I was definitely like obsessed, like completely hooked in like pure neurodivergent fashion. I was just like, right, single-minded, gonna do all I can on this. So yeah, it's been an extremely valuable tool for me, that I'm still doing my own work through.
See,
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting. This is something I had never really heard of before, ever. So when I first read the word and I didn't know or understand what it meant. And when you explain it now, it seems more like it's a deeper practice of getting to like in touch with yourself, in touch with why different things, you react the way you do. And it's like, on a conscious level, we can kind of do that. But this is taking it to a very deep unconscious, like your subconscious, and understanding how your body reacts to that and why it reacts that way. And it's really developing the relationship between you, your mind, and your body, as well as your spirit, in my opinion. And it
For
sounds really
sure.
beautiful. It
For
sounds
sure.
very powerful. I've never heard of this before.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I think this is a good
Yeah.
tool for adoptees, or even if you're not maybe adopted and you'd want to do that. I think it's a good tool overall,
Yeah.
especially for those
Yeah.
in lower mental
Yeah.
health.
No, I think it was good. Yeah. Yeah. I think, like we were saying before, trauma isn't what happened to you. It's what happens inside of you. And I think just about like everyone walking around on the earth has trauma in some way, shape, or form. And as the more I've studied trauma, the more I come to realize that it's not just our own trauma as well that we're carrying around. We've got intergenerational trauma.
Right.
We've got collective trauma. I think just living in this world is inherently traumatic.
Right.
And there's studies showing that something like up to 7 generations away can still be the trauma can still be stored in your nervous system. Like people will react
Right.
to things that have happened to their ancestors, in that survival mechanism way, which is really, really interesting to see. And I think in society, especially Western civilization, we've got a funny relationship with emotions and expressing emotions. And a lot of the time, even if we don't realize we're doing it, we're stifling our kind of natural expression of emotions. So, like if you look at other mammals, for example, like dogs, if they've been traumatized, they will shake to discharge their energy. And a lot of the time, as humans, we're always, and especially with prior trauma, that's the thing, is that we're always trying to be socially acceptable so that people
Right.
don't reject us. And so we prevent ourselves from doing these things. We stop ourselves from crying or shaking or, doing the movements that would naturally come to us. And this is basically, where somatics comes in, because somatics, it's so diverse. It could be anything. You've got things like ecstatic dance. You've got things like TRE, which is just shaking therapy.
Right.
You've got myofascial release, You've got all sorts of things, and they're basically just allowing the body to process what it needs to process in the way it was meant to process it. I think that's just
Right.
somatics.
So I have a
So
question.
yeah, sorry.
No,
Yeah,
you're
go.
good. I have a question. I want to interject it before I forget it because I'm not sure if you have done this. I've spoken to a few other adoptees who have also done this, but growing up, I used to do things like shake my head or like suck my thumb. That's kind of like a self-soothing thing. Is that sort of related to
Mm-hmm.
somatics as well, do you think? When you talk about like,
Yeah,
the different
so
types of
it could
therapies
be.
or
It could
the
be.
different. Mm,
Yeah, so the self-soothing behaviors like sucking your thumb, even with like what we commonly think of stims for neurodivergent people, they're basically like resources that make you feel a little bit better, that are comforting, and we can actually lean into those and find even more powerful resources and methods to kind of like anchor ourselves into
mm,
safety. And that's a lot of what we do in my kind of affirming safety somatic healing, is that we're actually just, and that's why I call it affirming safety, is we're actually just telling the body and letting the body know that the whatever traumatized it in the first place is over and that it's actually safe. And we can use kinetic anchors, we can use memory anchors, imaginary anchors. There's all sorts of ways that we can pendulate. So it's called pendulation
right.
because we're basically just swinging from this maybe unsafe feeling that you have in your body and this sense of safety. And a
Mm,
lot of people will feel trauma in their bodies, but they won't realize they're feeling it.
right.
So you might feel that knotted sensation in your stomach, or like an internal contraction in your gut, or just that tension in your shoulders. It might manifest as chronic
Right.
pain, and even chronic health conditions. There's been a lot of links between trauma, stress, autoimmune disorders, all sorts of things like that. And again, I'm going to be careful not to make any non-evidence-based claims, but it
Right.
is really fascinating, the research that's coming out within this field at the moment, because I think it's finally like getting the attention that it deserves. And I'm not sure if that's to do with how people's kind of perceptions changed around health to do with COVID and lockdown. I think there's been a surge, or at least a resurgence of interest in that area.
So, do you have a practice or do you practice with a group? Because, you specifically work with this and adoptees. And just tell us a little bit more about your practice and what you do, or like where you do it.
Yeah, so currently, currently I'm working a lot online, because I didn't want to narrow who I could work with. And I guess for me, I really enjoy connecting with other adoptees, other trans people, other queer people, other people like people of color, and just people where I guess I know that we can basically just see each other because we have that lived experience in common. So I wanted to be able to work with people internationally and stuff. So I'm mainly online at the moment. Obviously, if people around
Right,
Wales, South Wales, and Cardiff, like, please come to me. Um,
right.
so I basically work with like a 5-step kind of framework of healing.
Okay.
And so I kind of take people, and it will depend where people are when they come to me, kind of what we do, and it's all very. I mean, they're really the leaders in this. This is why it's like breathwork facilitation, and somatic
Mm,
facilitation. Like, I'm not particularly coaching people; like, they know their body the best. I'm just like a guide, but we can work on kind of that awareness of their nervous system states and nervous system regulation. And they're kind of the foundational steps that I think a lot of people miss out on, because I think, again, in society, we're kind of all in this rush to get to an end goal and an end point in healing, where it's like,
Right.
you know, we've almost like put a deadline on our healing, which, by the way, does not help our healing at all. We tend not to
Right.
heal so well when we're rushing our nervous system. But yeah, even just being able to recognize our various nervous system states. So I think a lot of people have heard of like the rest and digest and the fight and flight, but it's not as simple as that. I don't know if you've heard of polyvagal theory. So saying there's different subdivisions of the nervous system, and especially that parasympathetic branch of the nervous system. So we've got rest and digest, but we've also got a shutdown response. We've also got the more social engagement response, and then we've got the sympathetic fight or flight. I won't go into like all the names because that might just be confusing. But yeah, even just being able to recognize when we've kind of gone into these various states of, we call it arousal, can help us kind of be able to take back agency over where our nervous system is at. And once we can do that, we can build capacity to be able to feel the things we need to feel in order to heal. So yeah, that's basically what I'm doing with people. And then once we've kind of got to that point where people have that capacity, we can start using the breath and various different somatic processing techniques in order to resource the wounded parts of people back into that safety. And then from there, it's like, you know, once you start integrating that stuff into your life, it's really beautiful to see, really, because it's, you know, it's like things like you can finally have choices where before your body would just take over and you'd react in a triggered way, maybe without even realizing it.
Right.
Or, you know, you're finally able to experience your anger, but in a healthy, integrated way. So instead of your anger just like lashing out and becoming rageful, which was a definite experience for me. I think people that knew me wouldn't have maybe guessed it, but I had really big anger problems at one point, and there were times when I I broke stuff and was quite violent at home, and it was like a big issue for me. But yeah, we can feel into that anger as almost like our source of power and of like boundaries, and of knowing where our boundaries are rather than something to be feared. So yeah, yeah.
So having gone
Does that
through
answer
this,
your question?
oh no, you're fine. I enjoy being able to get a different opinion and having my mind just open and listening. I think it's important. Before we close out, I want to know, like, you going on this healing journey, coming from the place that you were at to where you are now. What is one thing in your wisdom now that you would tell your much younger self?
One thing. Oof. Okay. Like, I think I touched on a big one, which would be like that you're not broken. I think that one would have really helped me. But I think as well that there's not an end goal. I think that actually, I felt I had to get somewhere in terms of healing to be healed enough to be lovable and worthy and good enough as a human being. And actually that's not true at all. Like it's kind of capitalist thinking coming in. But it's also, it's also part of that trauma and conditioning that I think we all receive. And so, yeah, I think I'd just be like, things will happen in the timing that they're meant to happen. And, you said about how somatics is kind of connecting our mind and body and also our spirit. And I think, as the more I've healed, I think the more spiritually connected I felt. And I think I just let myself know that, it's this is becoming like 5 things now, but like that it's worth it to carry on, and that I think I'll find what I was searching for within me, that I think I was searching for it externally, but actually I think everything we need is within us already. A lot of the time it's just, being able to decondition and get out of our own way, in a sense.
Right. Well, I really love that. And I would like to thank everyone for joining me on this podcast episode of Chats with Kat. A very, very special thank you to our guest, Kellan. Thank you for being here. Stay tuned, everyone, for another episode
Thank you
on
for
the Voice of
inviting.
Adoptees podcast. So don't forget to like, subscribe, rate, share this episode so that Kellan's voice can be heard. Always remember, someone somewhere is thinking of you. You are not alone.